Marcus has his PhD in literary studies from the Center for Baltic and East European Studies at Södertörn University in Stockholm. He's currently their lecturer in literary studies. He's also a senior research officer for the program Time, Memory, and Representation, a multidisciplinary program on transformations in historical consciousness, financed by the Swedish Foundation for Humanities and Social Sciences. He has been a guest lecturer at Tübingen University, where he co-taught a course on migrant literature, focusing mostly on Peter Weiss and Nelly Sachs. Today he will speak on Swedishness and the refugee crisis, national identity and diversity under negotiation. Thank you. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks so much for being here. Lots of you. I'm really happy to see that. So, I had this talk all figured out, and then President Donald Trump made a comment on Sweden, and I basically had to redesign everything, because Trump's comment, as well as the reactions to it, have much to do with how notions of Swedishness, Swedish exceptionalism, has been and continues to be created in the public discourse. So the US is often used as a comparison, sometimes even created as the opposite of Sweden. So what I will try to present to you today are different ways of how Swedishness is constructed in the commercial, but also cultural sphere in recent years, not least after the entry of the nationalist and xenophobic party, the Sweden Democrats, into parliament 2010. So until this point, the Swedish parliament had been somewhat of an exception in Scandinavia, that unlike Finland, Norway, and Denmark, did not have a populist party arguing for a strict immigration policy in its parliament. Reflections on and negotiations of Swedishness and the role of Sweden in the world, traditionally linked to values such as social and economic equality, solidarity with the so-called third world countries, liberal immigration laws guided by a strong anti-racist pathos. So this discussion of precisely these values, as typically Swedish, were also intensified after the introduction of border controls in the fall of 2015, imposed in order to handle the large number of asylum seekers that had arrived earlier in the fall. So all in all, 163,000 people applied for asylum in Sweden that year. This decision to drastically tighten the immigration policy was made by the Social Democratic and Green Party government coalition only weeks actually after that the Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven had stated, "My Europe does not build walls." And about a half a year later, in the summer of 2016, there was a debate on Swedish values and on Swedishness in general during the so-called Almedalen week in Visby on the island of Gotland. So this week is usually considered to be the most important forum for Swedish politics every year. And Niklas Ekdahl, an editorial writer for the largest daily newspaper, Dagens Nyheter, wrote that all Swedish political parties seemed to suddenly, to agree on the fact that they all endorsed traditional Swedish values, although without being able to define exactly what these values were. There's an illustration I found online. So basically depicting all of the political leaders of the parties waving Swedish flags. So the leaders of the different political parties from left to right, they underscored Sweden's uniqueness and attractiveness internationally, but also the need for immigrants to learn Swedish as fast as possible, to be educated in Swedish gender equality, and to embrace the Swedish tradition of hard work, to do one's share, as the leader of the liberal conservative party, Moderaterna, put it. And this debate has been, and I think rightly so, interpreted as an effort to calm down widespread feelings of uncertainty that follow the reports on struggling welfare institutions that were unprepared to deal with a large influx of asylum seekers in the fall of 2015. So in other words, to reassert a sense of stable national identity in a world that seems to be increasingly precarious and unstable. So, in order to understand this debate on national identity, why was it suddenly so important to wave the Swedish flag? Something that, by the way, feels rather awkward for Swedes, for me as well. But also in order to contextualize the examples I will give further on how Swedishness today is negotiated, we need to just shortly explore how a Swedish national identity has been constructed historically. The American scholar Carly Elizabeth Schall, who will be joining us for the symposium, don't miss that, she highlights the ambivalences in Sweden's relationship to nationalism and the Swedish self-image in a very illuminating analysis of Sweden's National Day, which is a holiday only since 2005, and still is rather insignificant among the general public. Not many people actually celebrate it. With, the Swedish royal family actually do, and their fans, but among the general public, you don't really celebrate it more than just, you raise the Swedish flag in your garden. So, Schall points to the fact that Sweden's history as a nation is long and stable, and how it often has been described as an unproblematic case of early nationalization. So Swedishness has seemed to be somehow self-evident. Swedish national identity is, on the other hand, as every other national identity, amorphous and contradictory. And it demonstrates a history of combining both civic elements, such as a strong belief in equality and democratic ideals, as well as ethnic elements, emphasizing homogeneity as part of it. So in the 20th century, the self-image of tolerant, cosmopolitan, and internationalist nature of Swedishness has been added to earlier notions of Swedishness, such as love for nature and a romanticization of the Swedish free peasant. So this has given rise to the somewhat ironic effect in dealing with national symbols, as Schall points out, with reference to the Swedish flag. So while being, as she writes, enthusiastically waved at sporting events, it has also been regarded as a racist symbol by many in other contexts. So the fact that neo-Nazi skinheads often wore the Swedish flags on their bomber jacket sleeves in the early 1990s certainly plays into this circumstance. And this paradox is also true of the Swedish national anthem, which is sometimes suggested to be a provocation to non-ethnic Swedes because its association to neo-Nazi groups and other nationalist groups' use of it. Now, there is a very iconic artwork by the Swedish artist Carl-Johan De Geer that usually comes to mind when discussing the Swedish flag in Swedish art history from 1967. Here it is. And we see the Swedish flag burning, of course, and the text in English translation reads, "Desecrate the flag, refuse to carry arms, betray your native country, be unnational." And in the middle of the flag's cross, you find the Swedish word for the male genitals. That's the way I choose to translate that. And this piece was actually seized by the police back in '67, and the artist had to pay fines for desecrating the flag and agitation. So it was definitely regarded as controversial at the time. But today, I would say that nothing in it actually goes against the virtues of a Swedishness or the Swedish self-image constructed in the 20th century, namely of a tolerant, neutral, cosmopolitan, and internationalist Sweden. So perhaps desecrating a national symbol is the most patriotic thing you can do as a Swede, at least when you have a self-evident status of a natural-born Swede, whose Swedishness is not up for debate. And I want you to remember this for later when I will give you an example of how the Swedish flag, rather than being burned, is used to re-articulate a more, perhaps, inclusive way of Swedishness. But notion of Swedishness have also, as Carly Schall shows in her recent book, with the title The Rise and Fall of the Miraculous Welfare Machine, Nation, Immigration and Social Democracy in the 20th Century Sweden, published just last year. So she shows how Swedishness has been heavily influenced by the Social Democratic Party in Sweden in the first half of the 20th century. So the Social Democrats in fact succeeded in their efforts to link their political ideology with Swedishness, to be in favor of large-scale social reforms, universal health care, equal access to higher education, to the importance of trade unions. So in short, to be part of the effort to construct an all-encompassing folkhem, a people's home, to use the vocabulary of the famous Social Democratic Party leader Per Albin Hansson, from his so-called People's Home speech from 1928. So these components became equated with Swedishness. But Swedishness today cannot, as any identity for that matter, be constructed by itself, right? It needs a contrast, an other, against which it defines itself. Which brings me, of course, to Donald Trump. So, as you probably all know, the US President Donald Trump mentioned Sweden a few weeks ago. In particular, something that was supposed to have happened in Sweden last night, together with European cities that have suffered from terrorist attacks, such as Paris, Brussels, Nice, implying that Sweden's openness to refugees and the influx of asylum seekers had resulted in chaos and mayhem. This quickly led to Swedish government agencies, along with Swedish newspapers, to question this statement. There had, in fact, not happened anything particular in Sweden that Friday. And there was also a wave of internet memes and jokes produced in the wake of the statement, such as this one, the t-shirt with "I survived last night in Sweden." Many public figures, among them the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, who headed the center-right government of Sweden in the early 1990s. He criticized Trump's statement and the general image of Sweden as a state in decline because of immigration, in an article in the Washington Post. Instead, he underscored how Sweden, without its history of labor and refugee immigration, would not be the economically and culturally prosperous country it is today. The Sweden Democrats, on the other hand, published an article in the Wall Street Journal claiming that Trump, in fact, was right with reference to violence and riots occurring in the suburbs dominated by immigrant populations. So suddenly Sweden became a pawn in a general polemic about immigration in the Western world, used by Trump as a frightening example of a state supposedly gone out of control because of immigration. And this polemic is, by the way, still going on. Since the point of my talk today is to discuss Swedish identity and the Swedish self-image, I'm not going to address these very important topics, such as integration and immigration in the Swedish context, the design of the Swedish welfare state, immigration policies, integration measures, but these will be, all of them, addressed at our symposium. So we will, for example, have Grete Brochmann from University of Oslo, who will give a keynote speech on immigration and the Nordic welfare states. We also have Benjamin Teitelbaum, who will give a paper about the recent polemic between Trump and Sweden, but also the unfolding relationship between Trump and the Sweden Democrats, so don't miss that. But back to Trump's comment on Sweden, the relationship between the US and Sweden is important for the construction of Swedishness, I claim. And that's why I'd like to contextualize Trump's statement historically. Because Swedes listen very carefully to what the US thinks about Sweden. And conceptions of the US are also often used in Sweden in order to produce feelings of distinction and uniqueness. And I will get back to this topic shortly. As many already have pointed out, in the debates following Trump's remark, it is only the latest in a long tradition of US politics where Sweden is used either as a very positive example or as a very negative one. Liberals and others on the left in the political spectrum have tended to refer to Sweden as an example of a well-functioning society, actually able to combine capitalism with welfare reforms such as universal health care, paid parental leave, unemployment security, etc. Just like the other Scandinavian countries, by the way. Conservatives and other critics from the right, on the other hand, have tended to use Sweden as an example of a socialist dystopia. This is my favorite example. Cover of Time magazine from 1976, and here they have used images from Ingmar Bergman's movie The Seventh Seal, featuring Death himself there on the cover. As Stephen J. Kalman at the Harvard Kennedy School points out in a recent interview in Dagens Nyheter, the daily, biggest daily in Sweden, these Trouble in Paradise articles on Sweden have been a recurring trope in the US media in the last 10 years, usually structured according to a logic going something like this. On the surface, Sweden looks like an egalitarian utopia, but when you take a closer look, there are many problems. Now, Kellman and other scholars, such as the Swedish historian Lars Trädgård, they have pointed to the publication of Marquis Charles' book Sweden, the Middle Way from 1936 as the starting point for using Sweden as an example in US domestic politics. In Charles' book, Sweden was described as a successful compromise between two political extremes, represented by the US and the USSR. And the book received a great deal of attention and was well received by the Roosevelt administration. The president himself pointed to the interesting case of Sweden where you, quote, have a royal family and a socialist government and a capitalist system all working happily side by side. Later, President Dwight Eisenhower would criticize Sweden as an, quote, experiment of almost complete paternalism that had resulted in a supposedly, quote, skyrocketing rate of suicide and more than twice our drunkenness. And he made this statement at the Republican Convention in 1960 during the election campaign, and this caused headlines in Sweden, of course, sparking controversy and debate. Now, Sweden at this time also gained a reputation of freedom, of sexual freedom or sexual depravity, depending on your moral convictions, as motion pictures produced in Sweden displaying nudity and implied scenes of intercourse were screened internationally. As for example this one, One Summer of Happiness, Arne Mattsson's film Hon dansade en sommar in Swedish, but also Ingmar Bergman's Sommaren med Monica, so in translation The Summer with Monica, renamed in its US distribution as Monica, the story of a bad girl. The devil controls her by radar. So they added a few elements. Now, these perceptions of Sweden are still, I would say, quite common, especially concerning the perceived high suicide rate. I'd like to give you my favorite example of this, a short passage from the film Blue in the Face by Wayne Wang from 1995, in which Lou Reed makes a few remarks about Sweden in a very kind of Eisenhowerian tradition. Hopefully this will work.
I get scared like in Sweden. You know, it's kind of empty, they're all drunk. Everything works. If you stop at a stoplight and don't turn your engine off, people come over and talk to you about it. You go to the medicine cabinet and open it up and there'll be a little poster saying, in case of suicide, call. You turn on the TV, there's an ear operation. These things scare me. New York, no.
Right, so okay, the examples I have given you is of Sweden, how Sweden has been imagined in the US today. But what does this have to do with notions of Swedishness in Sweden? Well, I want to give you two examples of how stereotypes about the US and the US society are used in Swedish commercials in order to produce a sense of distinction, of Swedishness among the general public in Sweden. And here we see examples of how precisely these Swedish welfare institutions and components of the so-called Swedish model are used to enforce Swedish exceptionalism. So in the two commercials I'd like to show you, we see how two typical institutions of the Swedish welfare state are framed by using cliches about the US, common in Sweden. So the important thing to remember here is, I think, that these commercials are aimed at a Swedish audience, primarily at least, in which humor and a sense of recognition produces feelings of Swedish self-assurance. So, let's begin with Systembolaget, the government-owned chain of liquor stores in Sweden. And here the role of Sweden as a forerunner in environmental policies is underscored against the notion of cutthroat capitalist. All right, but so these are two examples where Swedish welfare institutions are used and shown by framing them in a hip US cultural context. But there is also a strong tendency of trying to create a multicultural vision of Swedishness, often drawing on the Swedish self-image of tolerance and anti-racism. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, this self-image has been tested, not least since the introduction of stricter immigration rules, making these negotiations of tolerant Sweden and a more diverse form of Swedishness even more acute. So in order to illustrate to you what is at stake here in these negotiations of Swedishness, I'd like to begin this second part of my talk by shortly describing the origins of Sweden's reputation as a socially progressive, tolerant country guided by a strong anti-racist pathos. And I will limit this historical outlook to the most commonly referred examples, and then continue to discuss the criticism of this self-image, as well as give you an example of an effort to construct a more inclusive and perhaps thought-provoking sense of Swedishness today. Now, Olof Palme, the famous social democratic prime minister of Sweden, who was shot and killed in 1986, is perhaps the most pivotal symbolic figure for Sweden's international image as a socially progressive, anti-racist country. Palme took a radical and active public stance against racial segregation in the US, against apartheid in South Africa, but also against military interventions in the third world, whether made by the US or by the Soviet Union. In terms of US-Sweden relationship, Palme caused an outrage on part of the US government when he took part in a protest against the Vietnam War, walking side by side with the North Vietnamese ambassador stationed in Moscow back then, but he was visiting Stockholm. Palme was only the Minister of Education back then, but it nevertheless triggered the start of an ice-cold relationship between Sweden and the US that would last for many years. And Palme's position in these matters was in line with general policies made by the Social Democratic Party during the 20th century. They were heading the government for long stretches of the post-war period, with a few exceptions. So in terms of population size, Sweden was the largest donor per head to the post-colonial world, also profiling itself as a politically neutral country between the two superpowers with a strong peacekeeping ethos. Dag Hammarskjöld, the former Secretary General of the UN in the 1950s and early 60s until his death in a plane crash, certainly also strengthened Sweden's international reputation in these years. And today, Sweden is the Western country that, considering its population size, has proportionally received the largest amount of refugees, migrants, and accompanying family members. But as the scholar Tobias Hübinette and others have pointed out, the idea of anti-racism has become a crucial part of the Swedish national identity. A majority of Swedes, also after the last influx of asylum seekers into 2015, continue to be in favor of refugee immigration. The SOM Institute at the University of Gothenburg, which has collected data and conducted surveys on public opinion in Sweden since 1986, showed in its survey from the fall of 2015, during the big influx of refugees, that only 40% agreed with the statement that Sweden should welcome fewer refugees. So this figure can be compared with 60% who agreed with this statement in 1990. So it's a substantial change towards a more open attitude to immigrants. At the same time, many scholars have pointed to an increasing number of anti-racist voices who try to counter the widespread denial of racism in Sweden, and who argue that in order to construct or to counter structural and everyday racism, it is necessary to critically assess what they call Swedish exceptionalism. In other words, the national and international image of Sweden as the most anti-racist of white Western countries. Tobias Hübinette, for example, has studied a number of public debates taking place since 2011 surrounding the use and presence of racial stereotypes in Swedish visual culture across different media, such as, for example, stereotypical cartoons of people of color in children's books and in the commercial sphere. One example mentioned by him is the case of Walt Disney's Santa's Workshop from 1932, a show that has been aired on Swedish television on Christmas Eve since 1960, still being watched in an era of solemnity by a majority of Swedish families. I have strong memories of this myself. In 2012, the American Mother Company decided to remove some of the clips from its original version, among them an African American girl depicted as a so-called Pickaninny figure. The Swedish television company announced these changes, which caused somewhat of an uproar in the Swedish public. According to a poll by the Swedish daily Aftonbladet, 92% of the 40,000 responses were against the removal. Hübinette also writes about the fact that this was reported in Denmark as a typical example of Swedish politically correct censorship, even though it in fact was a decision made by the American company. He also quotes the spokesman for the Danish public service company, proudly stating for Danish media that they would be screening the, quote, politically incorrect version from 1932. No censored version here. Since my time is limited, I will not delve further into these and other recent debates, but I'm happy to share the references to works on this topic if you're interested. What I would like to highlight instead is the question that Hübinette tries to answer, namely why so many white Swedes, including, as he writes, quote, highly educated, leftist, liberal, and self-identifying anti-racists want to defend and preserve racial stereotypes in the name of anti-racism. In spite of critique coming from Swedes of color who explicitly state that they are offended and feel humiliated by them. Now, as Hübinette shows, the debates have often led to a very destructive deadlock between majority Swedes, on the one side, feeling hurt because of accusations of being racist, and on the other hand, minority voices being accused of oversensitivity, aggressiveness, and of encouraging censorship. Rather than arguing that the majority Swedes would hold racist convictions, Hübinette instead interprets the defense by many majority Swedes of racial stereotypes in Swedish visual culture as an effort to defend Swedish anti-racism and the ideal of anti-racist Sweden itself. He furthermore understands the critique against the stereotypes coming from Swedes of color as a claim to be included within a Swedishness, as he writes, which until now has excluded them due to the hegemonic Swedish whiteness, which equalizes Swedishness, whiteness, and anti-racism. Now, I think Hübinette is on to something crucial here, namely a desire of creating a sense of national belonging that actually allows and can accommodate an increasingly diverse and multiracial Sweden. This can, of course, only be accomplished if pressing social issues such as ethnic segregation, social inequality, poor schools in poor segregated areas, etc., are dealt with on a very broad scale. The American geographer and Sweden specialist Alan Pred explored precisely these issues and the blind spots of Swedish anti-racist self-image in his book Even in Sweden, Racism's Racialized Spaces and the Popular Geographical Imagination from 2000, which is a study that primarily focuses on the 1990s and the debates surrounding immigration back then, against the background of economic recession and globalization. It is striking, I think, reading this book 17 years after its publication, how many of the issues that dominated the public discourse in early 1990s Sweden seem to resurface today. So I only mention this as a side note. If anyone is interested in the topic, I think Alan Pred's book is a good way to start. So, what about new ways of conceptualizing Swedishness today in a more multicultural sense? Breaking with the tradition of ethnic homogeneity towards a vision of a broader understanding of Swedishness, able to actually accommodate ethnic and cultural diversity. So, I will begin by showing you an example that might, at least at first glance, seem to further an ideal of Swedishness in terms of a more kind of culturally diverse, ethnically diverse notion. It's the first in a series of Volvo commercials featuring Sweden's all-time soccer star, Zlatan Ibrahimovic. So born in the immigrant neighborhood of Rosengård in Malmö to parents from former Yugoslavia. And in this video you hear a voiceover in which Zlatan himself recites the Swedish national anthem in his distinct Malmö dialect of immigrant Rosengård Swedish. And to enhance the level of nationalist pathos, we see Zlatan himself flexing his muscles in a winter landscape in the mountains. Remember nature's crucial role as national Swedish symbol. And taking care of his family in a cozy countryside cabin. And as the grand finale of the video, the final passage in the original version of the national anthem, in English translation, "Yes, I want to live, I want to die in Norden, in the north," is modified to, "Yes, I want to live, I want to die in Sweden." So thus enforcing the nationalist message even more. So let's watch this commercial. So the combination of the boy born to immigrant parents in a struggling suburb who turns into a soccer superstar and who then professes his loyalty to Sweden and traditional Swedishness was very successful among the Swedish public, soon receiving millions of views on YouTube. In a very interesting analysis of the mediatized Zlatan, by the Swedish scholar Kristin Sarmo, she shows how Zlatan tends to be constructed as the ideal immigrant, the young, rebellious, and individualist ghetto teenager who is finally assimilated and integrated into traditional Swedishness. In Sarmo's own words, quote, "normative masculine heterosexuality combined with a traditional marriage, 2 children, and a Volvo underscores Zlatan's Swedishness." So within this multicultural success story narrative, traditional Swedish nationalism can be performed and reaffirmed. And as a revealing contrast to this, Sarmo quotes a passage from an interview with Zlatan in The Times when he was promoting his autobiography. So I quote, "I know that I have become a symbol of multiculturalism," he says, "but I still feel like a bit of an outsider. When I was growing up, I was not a real Swede. I did not have a name like Eriksson or Karlsson. I was always the snotty-nosed immigrant, having to work twice as hard to get the same respect. I think the country is changing for the better now. We are more together, and I am glad I have been a part of that. But I still feel a distance, that sense of being on the outside. You can't take the guy out of the ghetto, but you cannot take the ghetto out of the guy. End of quote. So one could actually ask oneself if this commercial would have been equally successful if Zlatan would have expressed feelings of indifference towards his Swedish homeland and the question of his Swedish identity, or perhaps even resentment. I don't need you anymore. I can live wherever I please, and people all over the world adore me. I don't think it would have been the same kind of success. Which I think goes to say that the amount of ethnic difference allowed within the framework of contemporary Swedishness is conditioned and limited. Finally, I'd like to give you one example of how Swedishness is negotiated today from the bottom up, so to say, namely by young Swedes with immigrant family backgrounds. This is Sweden is an anti-racist platform and clothing collection created by Anna and Pablo Londono. And they both arrived in Sweden as refugees. It was also made, so it's a clothing collection, but it was also made into a exhibition in cooperation with the photographer Patricia Reyes, in which about 100 people, so friends and colleagues of them, took part. And in an interview by the fashion magazine Bonn, they describe how they began to think about the project with their own story as immigrant kids as point of departure, and a desire to feel proud of a country with a diverse population, but also as a reaction to the political development and discomfort they felt concerning the rise of nationalism and racism in Europe, but also in Sweden. So they were inspired by their childhood in Säter, where immigrants from all over the world mixed their cultures with what they could find in the second-hand shops or at the local recycling facility. But they also wanted to pay tribute to the Nordic handicraft tradition and style, which was part of the upbringing. So their work began as a play with stereotypes around Swedishness. As for example, in the case of the so-called resistance kit that you see here. Symbols that you're supposed to arrange yourself on your clothes of your liking. With it, they say that they want to foreground the individual behind the cliches, but also engage in a conversation on the long list of prejudices that condition our perception of each other. They also want to address those clothes that we all wear, but that you are unable to remove from your body, but still keep conditioning the way you are perceived by your surroundings, namely your skin. To wear This Is Sweden clothes, they claim, can be a way of reclaiming symbols that have been called into question, and use them to promote what they call an anti-racist agenda, to engage in a conversation at your workplace, in the street, at the cafe, with people who start to ask you questions about the symbols and your clothes. This is not always easy or smooth. In an interview, the designers talk about some of their white friends who have worn the most controversial item from their collection, the bomber jacket, and who have experienced hostility because of the bomber jacket's history of being used by Swedish neo-Nazis in the 1990s. But this experience also made them reflect on the negative assumptions associated with their skin color combined with a specific garment, making them aware of how a particular skin color can condition the way you are treated in public space. So it serves a purpose, according to the designers. I think their example is interesting to compare with Carl Johan de Geer's burning of the Swedish flag. Here, the Swedish flag seems to be reclaimed, or at least to become a tool for a conversation on the limits, but also the possibilities of Swedishness, of how it historically has been associated with whiteness, and how the combination of these symbols on bodies that do not necessarily correspond with the tradition of Swedishness as whiteness makes you imagine new possibilities of belonging. So, is this anti-racist Swedishness to be considered as only a reproduction of the 20th century trope and Swedish self-image of tolerant, anti-racist and immigration-friendly Sweden, albeit in a shape of a new stylish and hip clothing collection? In my view, that would be too simplistic a criticism, because I do think that this example demonstrates a substantial difference in comparison to, for example, the Zlatan commercial. The project has actually been created by individuals who themselves have been raised in bi or even tri-cultural environments, who have experiences in identifying the hypocrisies, but also virtues of the current Swedish multicultural and tolerant self-image. So in terms of the discussions taking place around Swedishness and national belonging today, in an increasingly multicultural Sweden, they are indicative. I think that's it. Thank you very much.